Human beings, on the whole, hate mysteries. True mysteries, that is. The ones where the detective sits down at the end and explains the elegant solution to us are great, but a mystery that cannot be solved is unacceptable. No matter how impossible or implausible a solution may be, no matter how far off the solution is, we will not stop trying to figure this mystery out. And I think that there is no truer testament to that than the medieval manuscript known as the Voynich Manuscript. The Voynich Manuscript is a probably medieval book that is written in a language that no one can understand, and the colorful illustrations interspersed between this text do nothing to clarify the matter. It depicts plants that are uncannily alien to any plants that we know. It illustrates baffling, grand, cosmological scenes. It has pages upon pages packed with nude women in green baths. But I think that the most strange thing of all is just how much effort was put into this incomprehensible tome. It doesn't look nonsensical or haphazard. It looks like it has meaning. And that means that for the last 400 years or so, history's best scholars, cryptographers, and even modern computers have tried desperately to figure out what that meaning is. What secrets does the Voynich Manuscript hold? Well, spoiler alert, nobody knows the secrets of the Voynich Manuscript as far as academia is concerned, although plenty of people have suggested things, and I have my preferences among those suggestions. But the thing that I really find fascinating about the Voynich Manuscript is not the solving of this mystery, but the way that this mystery itself acts as a mirror, reflecting the most inexplicable, unsolvable, and mysterious parts of human nature back at us. And one thing about me is that when I'm reading medieval documents, I like to be comfortable, and I've gotten a whole lot more comfortable thanks to this video's sponsor, Flexispot. I don't know about you guys, but I sit a lot, and I do not pay nearly enough attention to what I'm actually sitting on. For a while now, I've been using this stool, which is, not great. It's wobbly, it's uncushioned, and it doesn't have enough room for me to sit shrimp style like I prefer to. But thanks to this video's sponsor Flexispot and their C7M chair, my spine has been saved. Flexispot's C7M is an incredibly comfortable rolling chair that is so adjustable. From the angle of the headrest to the height of the backrest, even to the seat depth, you're going to be able to make this chair fit you perfectly. It has excellent lumbar support and an incredibly soft seat cushion. And with its highly adjustable armrests, whether you're typing, crafting, or just relaxing, you're going to be able to be completely comfortable and supported. No matter how it is that you like to sit, this chair is going to be able to accommodate it. If you want to try sitting more comfortably, give the Flexispot C7M a try. You can try it out risk-free thanks to their 30-day return policy, and they have a 10-year warranty with direct replacement on any damaged parts. If you have a limited budget, you can check out their C5 chair, which is still incredibly comfortable and pretty adjustable, and they just launched their newest model, the C7 Morpher, which features an upgraded lumbar support and upper backrest. You can check all of this out at the link in my description and use my code C750 to get $50 off. Thank you so much to Flexispot for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. Let's begin with an exploration of what this thing actually is. Also known as the Beinecke MS-408 in its current library standing, the Voynich manuscript is called such because it was once purchased by book collector Wilfrid Voynich in 1912. Despite its huge reputation, this is actually a relatively small book. It's about 10 by 7 inches, that is 25 by 18 centimeters for you metric folks, and it is 234 pages long, with many of those pages being fold-outs, in which the page literally folds out of the book to become a larger writing surface. The pages are made from vellum, a type of thin animal skin parchment, and in the case of the Voynich manuscript, this is specifically calf skin. It's believed that there are definitely some pages missing from the Voynich manuscript, probably not a lot, but it was unbound and reassembled at some point. The cover, at least, is not original. It's just a plain piece of vellum, which is a very cheap technique that's basically the equivalent of a Renaissance paperback novel. So we don't know why it was rebound or recovered, but we're pretty certain that it was. It's believed that the many illustrations in this book actually came first, and that the text was then written around that, and that within these illustrations, the outlines were done first, and then due to the layering of the ink, we can see that they were colored in later. The pigments used for coloring are made from medieval materials such as egg whites, azurite, copper, and ochre, which are all relatively inexpensive, but make for very vibrant colors. The writing was done in a quill pen with iron gall ink, a dark brown ink that was commonly used throughout the medieval period. One of the things that has most eluded Voynich scholars is the exact date of the manuscript's origins. Carbon dating places the parchment itself with a 95% probability of having originated from 1404 to 1438, but that does not tell us when the ink and paint was applied to that parchment. Although the parchment is almost certainly from that 1404 to 1438 time period, who knows when the manuscript was written or assembled. Still, the writing, the paint, and the binding style are all in line with this early 15th century date of creation, so barring intentional deceit, which we'll discuss later, I'm pretty comfortable saying that the manuscript was produced sometime in the mid-15th century. Besides, even things like the style of buildings drawn, the hairstyles on the human figures, all correlate with this date pretty cleanly. The location of the manuscript's origin is a bit more challenging to pin down, but the general assumption is Central Europe, specifically Italy. This Italy assumption comes from the fact that in one of the only trackable real-world illustrations we have in the Voynich manuscript's pages, we can see a castle whose stylized crenellations match 14th and 15th century Italian castles. So it was maybe Italy, but probably at the very least Central Europe. This theory even continues to hold water for the people that think that this manuscript was influenced by Eastern or Near Eastern culture, because during the late medieval period, Italy was a major crossroads from east to west, where there was a lot of cross-cultural communication. But I think that by far the most mystifying thing about the Voynich manuscript is the text, which is written in a script which we now aptly call Voynichese. This flowing style of writing is not immediately recognizable as any known alphabet, but its similarities to non-Latin scripts like the Humanist minuscule or Arabic have been noted. There are around 25 distinct letters in the Voynichese script, and these letters are organized by spaces into words, which are then organized into something that looks structurally similar to a paragraph. These words are, on average, 5 to 6 characters long, which hits about the same average as most English words, but it is worth noting that in the English language, we have a lot more variety on either side of that bell curve. Voynichese is much more tightly averaged around that 5 to 6 characters, whereas English has words that are much longer and much shorter. One strange quirk is that in Voynichese, we often see identical words appearing in succession, over and over and over again, far more often than you would see in most languages, especially in European tongues. The word organization seems relatively sporadic, except that it has been noted that there seem to be topics to pages, that is, singular words that appear more often on certain pages rather than others. It's kind of like how if you were comparing the Wikipedia page for chairs and the Eiffel Tower, the word chairs is going to appear a lot more in the article on chairs. This implies, through some degree of extrapolation, that the author was possibly writing about something. You're going to notice that in a lot of the research about the Voynich manuscript, especially the language, there's a lot of conjecture involved, a lot of saying that, well, maybe this means something. Maybe. But that's kind of just how this kind of scholarship goes. But one thing that really changes the game is the fact that the Voynich manuscript was almost certainly not written by one person. And between these different authors, there seem to be different forms of this language. Prescott Currier was the first person to speak on this matter, and he believed that there were anywhere between 5 and 8 different hands writing this manuscript. And between these multiple scribes, there also seems to arise different languages, or at the very least dialects of the same language. The differences are subtle, existing mainly in the variety of letters used and the frequency of letter substrings, but they are definitely changed from one hand to another. Now, this isn't unheard of in medieval texts. Before the English language was relatively standardized, there were many different dialects, many different styles of grammar, and from one scribe to another, it might seem like you're reading an entirely different language, even if they were both writing in Old English. But in the case of the Voynich manuscript, this may imply that whatever rules or systems were being used to create this writing, they may not have been completely consistent. The contents of the manuscript are generally divided into 6 sections. The first section, the botanical or herbal section, is by far the longest, and it contains large illustrations of a variety of plants accompanied by Voynich's text. And some of these plants almost look like real plants. In 1944, Hugh O'Neill published his findings, which was identifying a couple of plants from the Voynich manuscript. This included a nettle plant, but also a sunflower and a capsicum or pepper plant. Now, what's really interesting about this is that if this was true, it would put a date on how old the manuscript could be, because both sunflowers and capsicum are plants from the Americas, meaning that the manuscript couldn't be any older than 1493 at the absolute oldest. Then again, I suppose it's kinda up to you if you think that this looks exactly like a sunflower plant, but it is interesting how clues inside of the manuscript can give us an idea of the age or the provenance. In modern efforts, Edith Sherwood has published an entire website where she goes through the manuscript page by page, identifying possible plant matches for the botanical section, and while some of these are fairly convincing, I would say, some are less convincing. So again, we really will never be able to prove empirically that one plant is another, but it is an interesting thought experiment. And part of the issue with finding exact matches for these plants is that almost all of them have something wrong with them, whether it be the parts of other plants grafted onto them, having claws for roots, or human faces growing on bulbs. The artist seems to have taken a bit of creative liberty with nature. Now, you could claim that the artist just wasn't very good or hadn't seen a lot of these plants for themselves. You could say that they were bored and feeling creative, or maybe if we were able to translate the Voynich's text around these illustrations, it would all make sense. But either way, the mysteries of the botanical section establish a serious precedence for the rest of the book. It's these things that look real, that look like they could be part of a medical text or a guide to herbs, but they're just uncannily wrong. The second section is referred to as the astronomical or astrological section. These pages are adorned with stars and star charts, including a depiction of the astrological signs in great wheels, surrounded by nude women, holding and surrounded by stars. It goes through each of the zodiac signs, sometimes repeating them. However, Aquarius and Capricorn are missing, but it's believed that the only reason they were missing is because those pages have been removed or lost. One article that I found actually proposed that that was someone's star sign, Aquarius or Capricorn, and so they took the pages for themselves, which is impossible to prove, but is a kind of realistic and pretty funny way to think of what happened. The next section is a bit odd, to say the least, and that is the balneological portion, or the baths. These pages contain sections of text fringed with illustrations of women in what appear to be baths which pour out of strange tubes and vessels. These women are largely nude, their proportions are a little bit strange, and it is only women depicted in the Voynich manuscript. Some of them have different hairstyles, some of them are wearing crowns, but they all seem to be involved in this process of bathing in bizarre green liquids. Now, it is worth pointing out that in the Middle Ages, healing baths were quite a thing, especially in the case of women's health. And if we pair this up with the botanical section from the beginning, this might suggest that it's some sort of a women's health guide. It's also been pointed out how these strange systems of moving liquids kind of resemble internal organs. There's one that is specifically compared to the fallopian tubes of a woman a lot. And again, if this was some kind of a medical text, you have the botanical section to explain these herbs, you talk about the stars a little bit, which were relevant in some kinds of medieval medicine, and then you have a section on the internal workings of the human or female body. It makes some sort of sense. Some Voynich scholars have also found an echo for this imagery in the alchemical art of the era. Alchemy was a very mysterious and secretive craft at this time, and many of the illustrations and art that would accompany books or diaries about alchemy would use kind of allegorical depictions. If you were to discuss the dissolving of gold and silver in an alchemical bath, you might illustrate this point with a depiction of the sun and moon standing in for the raw materials, bathing together in a particular kind of bath. Now, of course, correlation does not equal causation, and there are some pretty considerable differences between the alchemical art and balneological portion of the Voynich manuscript, but in a portion of this book that seems almost incomprehensible, this is one of the very few extant, at least visual parallels that we can point to. The next section of this book is less salacious, but possibly even more confusing, and that is the cosmological section, also known as the rose fold-out, because the pages unfold in both directions, giving you this massive spread. This illustrated portion shows these vast, kaleidoscopic islands or rosettes ringed by Voynich's script, connected by surreal causeways or veins. There are some proposed explanations for this portion of the book. It is called cosmological. Perhaps this is the way that someone sees the planes of existence or reality, but without any interpretation from the text, it's very hard to say. After the cosmological section, we have the pharmaceutical portion, also known as the recipes. In these pages, the plants from the botanical section are shown dismembered, broken into their component parts, accompanied by a series of strange jars. Perhaps if the botanical section was introducing these plants to the reader, the pharmaceutical section is showing them what to do with these plants, the kind of medicines that could be made if we're to go with the medical book theory. The final pages of the Voynich manuscript are referred to as the textual section. As the name implies, this portion is the densest in terms of Voynichese, consisting of blocks of text, each marked off by a star shape. This section is also referred to as the recipes section, based on a theory that it's the written out recipes that were proposed in the pharmaceutical section, but because the pharmaceutical section is also called the recipe section, I thought it would get confusing, so let's just think of it as textual. So that means that, in summary, the Voynich manuscript is made up of the following sections: the botanical, the astronomical, the balneological, the cosmological, the pharmaceutical, and the textual. Sections like the botanical, the pharmaceutical, even the astronomical have some sort of medieval precedence. We see other books that kind of look like they do, but other ones like the balneological and the cosmological are a little bit more mysterious. And unfortunately, the history of this artifact is just about as confounding as its contents. A 17th century letter states that the manuscript first entered the public eye in the late 1500s, when it was purchased by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II for a cost of 600 ducats, or around $50,000 today. This ownership would seem to be confirmed by contemporary multispectral imaging, which allows us to see the now invisible signature on the pages of the Voynich manuscript of one Jacobus Horczycki de Tepanek, a pharmacist from the early 17th century who worked in the court of Rudolph II. The two of them worked quite closely together, and it makes some sense that Jacobus would have received the manuscript from the emperor. Now, Jacobus signed this manuscript De Tepanek, which was a title that he had only received in 1608, and he died in 1622. So if this is his signature, the manuscript would have been in his possession between 1608 and 1622. This signature and the dates associated with it are the very first firm, somewhat provable trace that we have of the Voynich manuscript in history. And although many people have theorized on how exactly the manuscript got into Emperor Rudolf II's possession, we just don't know. But the thing that this proves to us, other than the fact that the manuscript existed by the year 1622, is that from its very first inception, from the first moment that this manuscript enters the historical record, it was a marvel. It was something that people wanted to solve. After all, that was why it had come into the emperor's possession in the first place. When Jacobus died, he intended for all of his fortune to go to the Jesuits, including the Voynich manuscript, but for some reason it did not. And so for the next 15 years, we don't know what happened to the manuscript. Its next recorded appearance was in 1637, when, through unknown means, it came into the possession of the alchemist Georgius Bartius. Bartius sent copies of the Voynich's text to a scholar for decoding, and although it was a futile effort, the letter that was sent in reply in 1639 is the first-hand reference we have of the manuscript. Although the scholar that Bartius contacted was unable to decipher any part of the text, he concluded that it was, as far as he could tell, medical in nature. When Bartius died, he left all of his possessions to Johannes Marcus Marci. It was Marci in 1665 who wrote a letter telling of the manuscript's provenance in the court of Rudolf II, which is how we today now know about it. In this same letter, Marci also claims that this manuscript was originally written by the 13th century scholar Roger Bacon, but we'll get back to that later. After this, the whereabouts of the manuscript are unknown for about 250 years, although it's believed that it probably went into the care of the Jesuits, where it was just kept in a library somewhere. And the next time that our manuscript pops up is in 1912, when it was being sold to one Wilfrid Voynich. And Voynich himself was a bit of a colorful character. Born in 1864, Voynich had trained to be a pharmacist at the University of Moscow before getting involved in a social revolutionary group and a prison break gone wrong, which earned him 5 years of exile in Siberia. Voynich escaped to London, where he made a name for himself in society as a rare and antique book dealer, and he was particularly unique for the fact that he was willing to go himself to the continent to procure his books. In 1912, he purchased the Voynich manuscript, and it would remain in his care until his death. Voynich was just as entranced by this manuscript as everyone else had always been, and he spent the rest of his life sending out copies of the manuscript to scholars for decryption. And while this never earned him any concrete results, it did earn him an investigation by the FBI, because he was talking an awful lot about decryption at a time when decrypting stuff was a pretty intense military ordeal. When Voynich purchased the manuscript, it came with that letter from Johannes Marcus Marci, in which he explained that it had been owned by Rudolf II, and where he said that it had been written by Roger Bacon. And this led Voynich to a lifelong belief that this was true, that it was composed by Roger Bacon. And to his credit, the idea does make some sense. Bacon was a legendarily intelligent and well-educated man, a philosopher, theologian, and scientist who was thoroughly interested in investigating the ways of nature. He's regarded by some people as the very first true Western scientist, and some of the things that he said were not things that the church agreed with. So it's not out of the question to say that he would have wanted to create a cipher that could hide some of this research from prying eyes, and due to his intelligence and his education, he would have been capable of creating such a thing. And because of this, and because there was no evidence to the contrary throughout the 20th century, the Voynich manuscript was unquestioningly attributed to Roger Bacon. Of course, now, due to carbon dating, we assume that the parchment is from 1408 at the oldest, and Bacon died in 1292. So unless he managed to find the Philosopher's Stone and reach immortality, it is pretty unlikely that Bacon was the actual author. So while we do have proof that Marcy's letter was correct in saying that Rudolph II at one point owned this manuscript, the belief that Roger Bacon is the author has slowly lost steam throughout the years, and it's mostly been debunked at this point. Wilfrid Voynich died in 1930, and he left the manuscript to his wife Ethel. Ethel Voynich died in 1960 and left the manuscript to a friend, and this friend sold it to a rare book dealer. This rare book dealer was unable to find a buyer for it, and so he donated it to the library of Yale University. There it has stayed in the Beinecke Library, where it has been much analyzed and endlessly discussed, but still barely better understood than it was in 1939, when it was declared to probably be some sort of a medical text. But by God, many people over the decades have tried to figure this manuscript out, and I think we can narrow it down to 3 options for what this thing could be. The first option is that the Voynich manuscript is written in a natural language, a real spoken language, but that it has been intentionally ciphered into secrecy. The second option is that it's written in a natural language, but that it is unciphered, but the language was lost to time, or it was an invented language whose dictionary has not survived. And the third option is that the Voynich manuscript is meaningless, either by design or due to some kind of break in reality from the author. By far, the most popular solution is the first one, and many people have tried to decode this text. The first came from William Newbold in 1921, when he was approached by Voynich himself to help solve this puzzle. Newbold was a professor of Latin and philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, and his proposal was that each of the Voynich's letters was actually made up of a series of tiny, microscopic Latin letters. His theory was that Roger Bacon, who they thought was the author at the time, had used a microscope to write these letters in a kind of anagrammic, scrambled language that could be unscrambled into plain text. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, that anagrams are not an exact or replicable science. The letters M, N, E, and A could become a lot of different words, and so it's up to the translator or the decipherer to choose which word that is. And if it's a medical text, you want to know the difference between amen and name. That seems pretty considerable. And even then, even with the flexibility allowed in anagrams, Newbold's translation just wasn't really all too coherent. And then there's the fact that this solution relies on Bacon using a microscope in the 1200s, when they weren't invented until the 1600s. Now, is it possible that Roger Bacon invented a microscope like 400 years early and kept it a secret through his entire life? Sure, it's possible, but it's not exactly probable. And then, of course, there's probably the biggest issue with Newbold's theory, which is that the Voynich's text is not made up of tiny Latin characters. What he identified as the divides between these Latin characters were actually just microscopic cracks in the ink. While it was initially praised, Newbold's interpretation was, by the 1930s, pretty thoroughly debunked, but that didn't stop other people from trying. Cryptography was a growing area of study in the 20th century, and due to the encouragement of both world wars, it was quickly becoming a profession. After the Second World War, the US military's cryptographers actually took on the Voynich manuscript, but they weren't able to come up with any provable solutions. In 1947, Lionel C. Strong published his findings, which translated some lines of the Voynich manuscript very elegantly. The only issue was that he refused to publish his key, how he had actually gotten this translation. Scholars attempted to reverse engineer it, to test his methods, but they were unable to find any logical methodology behind the translation effort. And that means that upon closer examination, his results did not hold up to academic inquiry. But part of the problem was that most of these scholars were thinking in a very classical way. They assumed that once deciphered, the Voynich manuscript would translate into Latin, Italian, or German, which were the typical languages for the area. But not every scholar was locking themselves into this particular criteria. And in 1978, John Stoiko published a book with his translation of the Voynich manuscript. He claimed that the manuscript had originally been a series of letters written in Ukrainian, which explains why some of these more classical efforts failed. A portion of Stoiko's translation reads, "Where after religion you believe in religion and wish that to aura. Emptiness is that what baby God's eye is fighting for. Eye of God, you are measuring empty religion for the world. Your aim, not religion, is living in you. Eye, be careful. You should remember one holy freedom and eternal conscience." Now, you may have noticed that that paragraph that I read made pretty much no sense. Not only is it kind of word salad with a lot of non sequiturs and words that don't actually make sense in a sentence together, but if this manuscript is, as Stoiko proposes, a treatise on the eye of baby God, a religious meditation exchanged between two people in letters, then why on earth is it in the form of a medical text? What's with all of the plants? Although Stoiko's translation was appreciated, particularly by Ukrainians who wanted to be able to claim cultural ownership and pride for the manuscript, most scholars have debunked Stoiko's translation as just not really making sense. All of these failed attempts make it clear that there are certain criteria that any solution for the Voynich manuscript must follow in order for it to be generally accepted. And in her essay, which I have highlighted in the sources in my description, Lisa F. Davis lines out 3 particular criteria. First, this method must be consistent with the known realities of the manuscript. Newbold's translation of the manuscript failed because it rested on the premise that the letters of the manuscript are made up from other tiny letters, and being that that is not true of the physical reality of the manuscript, his method is not true. The second criteria is that the method of decipherment must be explainable, and it must be able to be replicated by other people. This is where Strong's secret translation fell short, because there wasn't any logic behind it, and no one else could figure out how he did it. And the final thing that a method must provide is a translation that just makes sense. Certainly, we can all accept that maybe the Voynich manuscript is not a medical text, as so many people have assumed before, but the text should at least make sense with the illustrations that are on the page, and the words should flow together in a relatively coherent way. And the funny thing is that modern efforts, even with our so greatly advanced technology, have continued falling into these same traps. In 2017, Nicholas Gibbs came out with an article that definitively claimed to have solved the manuscript once and for all. He explained that the Voynichese text was in an abbreviated Latin language, and that the text revealed itself to be a guide to women's health. Gibbs claims to recognize a couple of Voynichese characters as certain parts of Latin shorthand, and he says that it would be very simple to decode the entire manuscript if only they hadn't removed the index. He claims that at one point attached to the manuscript, there was an index that explained how all of these pages and words interconnected, it explained the shorthand, and that if only we had that index, we would be able to understand the entire thing. And now, as crazy as that sounds, it's not entirely without basis. Many medical guides of this era did have indexes included in them to help people understand the terminology and how these things connected. However, we have no evidence that that many pages are missing from the Voynich manuscript. His argument kind of boils down to the idea that somewhere out there is a Voynichese dictionary, and that if we found that dictionary, we'd be able to solve the whole thing and it would be simple. And yeah, of course, but that is not consistent with the known physical realities of this object, and so it's not really a good argument. In 2018, Ahmet Ardich took on the Voynich Manuscript under the premise that it was written in an old form of Turkic. And at first this seemed pretty promising. For a long time we were locked into this very Eurocentric idea that it would translate into Latin, Italian, or German, and the idea that it would be a more Eastern language does hold some water. And on an individual word level, Ahmet Ardich and his sons were able to come up with some fairly compelling translations that lined up with the contents of the pages, with the imagery on the pages. However, when it came to translating larger portions of the text, Ahmet Ardich and his sons seemed to run into a problem that a lot of Voynichese scholars have. It's easy enough to translate a single word and get something comprehensible, but when it comes to making a bunch of words all together make sense grammatically and linguistically, things tend to fall apart a little bit. Although Ardich has been relatively vocal online about his theories and his translations, none of his efforts to be more soundly published in academic journals have been accepted. And so although this is an interesting premise, and I think it's a road that is worth exploring, I don't think that we can accept the kind of leaps in logic that would be required to claim that this is definitively the method for decipherment. In 2017, Greg Kondrak used AI to analyze the text and found that the Voynichese is most statistically similar to an anagrammatic form of Hebrew. However, his translations have not resulted in any coherent Hebrew sentences, so this is one of those things that falls in line with the third criteria, that the translation would have to make sense, and this translation simply does not. But it does provide important information to later Voynich scholars. So there have been a lot of attempts to decipher the Voynich manuscript, but some of the research being done these days isn't even into directly how to decipher the manuscript, but rather into what this decipherment might look like. And quite recently, an essay has come out from Michael A. Greshko that proposes and creates the Naibe cipher. Now, the Naibe cipher is not a key to deciphering the Voynich manuscript, but rather it is an invented cipher that proves that creating a text like the Voynich manuscript is possible by using some sort of a cipher. His Naibe cipher uses tools and techniques that would have been available at the likely time of the Voynich manuscript's creation to code Latin and Italian texts into a cipher that is statistically very similar to Voynichese, including all of its linguistic weirdness that has tripped up so many decryptors before. And Greshko's cipher is able to do this with some success. And while this certainly doesn't decipher the Voynich manuscript, it proves that, technically speaking, this could be a cipher, even if we haven't figured it out yet. But what if, with all of these deciphering attempts, we've been barking up the wrong tree? What if this isn't a code at all, but an unfamiliar and now lost language? Languages are very tricky and very ephemeral things, and before writing was common or accessible or well-maintained, a language could absolutely just be there one day and be gone the next, especially if it was a language only spoken by a small or isolated community. Now, would it be a little bit bizarre that this would be a part of a language family that we have no familiarity with, and that none of our best scholars have ever been able to translate this language? Sure, it would be a bit strange, but there are a lot of ancient languages we haven't been able to translate, and this would just be another one of them. Another really fascinating possibility is that the Voynich manuscript was written in a constructed language. I know I have a lot of Tolkien fans watching this right now, and I'm sure you've been pointing at your screen and going, wait, this kind of thing looks familiar. Tolkien created entire languages, entire texts, entire alien worlds for his stories, for the joy of just creating. And it is entirely possible that someone back in the 1400s had this joy, that they were a fantasist in the same vein of Tolkien, creating their Silmarillion. After all, humans have always had a strong desire for constructed languages. In the 11th century, scholar, theologian, and artist Hildegard von Bingen developed the lingua ignota, a unique alphabet and vocabulary inspired by her intense religious experiences. One of the earliest known human-constructed languages is Balé-Balan, which was possibly as old as the 14th century, but definitely existed by the 16th. Balé-Balan resembles languages such as Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, and survives through a dictionary outlining the language. It's believed that Balé-Balan was used for poetic or religious purposes, but we're also pretty certain that it was a man-made language, intentionally constructed from the roots of others. So why wouldn't it be possible that the author of the Voynich Manuscript had simply created their own language and written this manuscript in that language? It might seem kind of crazy to dedicate this much time, money, and effort to what is basically a hobby, but again, I point to the example of Tolkien, and I point to many of us, the people watching this video, and myself, who I'm sure have spent a couple of afternoons in the back of your math notebook creating your own language just for fun. It is completely possible that the Voynich manuscript is a constructed language, a lost language, or a natural language that has been ciphered. However, the fact that we have never been able to decipher or translate it leaves us with one more option. A kind of daunting one, and that is that the Voynich manuscript is actually meaningless. But why would anyone do this? Why would anyone spend this much time, money, and effort on something that was meaningless? Well, one possibility is that it could be the result of a psychological experience, either mental disturbance or religious revelation. Mental disorders, such as schizophrenia, can result in symptoms like graphoria or hypergraphia, in which someone is driven to write excessively and sometimes incoherently. This writing often looks scrawled and strange and doesn't follow proper grammatical rules. If someone was experiencing graphoria or hypergraphia, they were already not super literate, and they were writing in a strange language, this could absolutely result in text which they think means something, and thus it looks like it means something, but something that is indiscernible. The idea of religious revelation leading to this kind of writing is also something that we should pursue. Glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, is defined by William Samarin as a semantically meaningless but phonologically structured human utterance believed by the speaker to be a real language, but bearing no systematic resemblance to any natural language, living or dead. Glossolalia fits into an interesting part of this conversation, because it does hit a lot of the criteria. It's not decipherable or discernible, it is not translatable into any real natural language. However, the person speaking it does think that it means something, and is going to structure it as if it means something. And sometimes glossolalia can result in both illustrations and in writing. We find a lot of this glossolalic material coming from the Shakers, which was a movement that split from the Quakers in the 18th century, and they are known to both speak in tongues, by speaking the language of the angels, but also to illustrate and to write in this glossolalic way. The appearance of this art seems almost to echo some of the forms of the Voynich manuscript, and the writing that we see is flowing and consistent, but just as incomprehensible as Voynichese. There's even a precedent for this in the medieval period. Our good friend Hildegard von Bingen was known to experience divine visions through her entire life, and she expressed these through art and through writing, and these likely contributed to her creation and use of the lingua ignota, her constructed language. Scholars go back and forth on whether or not the lingua ignota was the result of a glossolalic experience, or if it was a constructed language created so that she could communicate more secretively with her nuns. But either way, it is completely possible that the Voynich manuscript is the result of some form of a glossolalic experience, which explains why it has been so indecipherable, but why it does look like it means something. The main thing that stands in the way of me accepting this theory of either mental disturbance or glossolalia is just how many hands participated in the creation of this manuscript. We believe it was anywhere between 5 and 8, possibly even more. And the likelihood that 5 separate people were all having the same mental or religious experience at once is pretty low. Now, this could be explained away by saying that the Voynich manuscript is not original. Perhaps it is a copied version of a more raw, singularly authored glossolalia text, or maybe even these 5 or 8 scribes were sitting there and recording one person's religious revelation. We simply cannot know. But another thing that pushes me away from the idea of it being a glossolalia experience is the content itself. Not that every religious experience is going to be about God specifically, but the entire botanical section, the balneological section, none of that reads to me as particularly religious in origin. The reality is that when it comes to the Voynich manuscript, it's really hard to rule anything out definitively. Except aliens. I'm pretty sure it wasn't aliens. And I think that it is this ambiguity that has led to the Voynich manuscript being so popular, because you can kind of claim anything, and as long as you make a reasonable enough argument, people can't say that you're outright wrong. The other day, I saw a Reddit post from someone saying that they had only heard of the Voynich manuscript like a couple hours ago, but they were pretty sure they had cracked the code. They said that it was definitively a 20-year-old woman living in Eastern Europe who had written a medical health guide. And like, yeah, I guess it could be. It could be a lot of things. Because it is very unlikely that we'll ever know for sure what this thing is without a doubt, because that's not how history works, we're left playing a game of possibility and probability. You're just gonna have to decide for yourself what you think is the most likely. And for me, personally, I think that it is most likely that the Voynich manuscript is a hoax. Sort of. Although it's a bit of a hotly contested idea, I firmly believe that the Voynich manuscript could just be gibberish. It could just be someone making something up. And part of the reason that a lot of people deny this theory is because the letters and the words in the Voynich manuscript are not random. There are repeated words, there are topic words, there are sentence structures that make a lot of sense. And this is true. The Voynichese language is not random. If you put a monkey in front of a Voynichese typewriter, it would take him a real long time to turn out an exact copy. But the thing is that this manuscript was composed in the Middle Ages, when the idea of pure computer-generated randomness wasn't a thing. Of course, according to computers, the Voynichese manuscript is very not random. That's because it was made by a human hand. Daniel E. Gaskell and Claire L. Bowen ran a study in which they got 42 volunteers to produce sample texts that were meaningless. They were gibberish, but the writers were asked to try and make them look meaningful. These sample texts were then compared to both the Voynich manuscript and actual meaningful texts, and they found that the statistical information of these gibberish texts lined up better with the Voynich manuscript than with meaningful texts. They conclude, "We cannot and do not attempt here to prove that the Voynich manuscript is gibberish. Our results do, however, invalidate traditional arguments that the small-scale structure of Voynichese is too non-random to be meaningless. Even without an explicit generative algorithm, intuitively generated gibberish can both adequately replicate many features of natural language and produce a wide range of other unusual properties, depending on the author and text in question. If the Voynich manuscript is indeed gibberish, in other words, it is perhaps not surprising that it would be both language-like and statistically unusual." Again, this is not meant to be a definitive statement, but it does open up a possibility. What if the Voynich manuscript was not meaningful, but was intended to look meaningful? There's a couple of reasons why someone might want to do that. One possibility that really just tickles my fancy is the idea that the Voynich manuscript could have been a sample text. In the modern day, this is sometimes referred to as a lorem ipsum, and it is basically placeholder text. It is nonsense text that looks real enough to stand in for the real thing. Perhaps if you're a scribe in the 15th century, you and your buddies get together and you create the Voynich manuscript to say, hey, you could have a manuscript that looks just like this if you hired us. I'm even reminded of the artifice involved in something like theater. I used to make props for theater, and one of the things that I was always told is that if an actor was going to be directly interacting with a prop, a text-based prop like a newspaper or a letter, you should make that prop nonsense. You should fill out those texts with gibberish, because if there was real text written there, if you're cracking jokes or something in the text, the actor could get distracted when they see it. So you should just keyboard smash, add paragraphs, add sentences and periods and punctuation to make it look like real text, even though it's gibberish. Now, am I professionally proposing that the Voynich manuscript was a prop for a medieval production of Guys and Dolls? No, I'm not doing that, but I'm just saying that there are a lot of reasons why someone might create gibberish that doesn't look like gibberish. But to me personally, the most tantalizing option of all is the idea that the Voynich manuscript is a really clever hoax, that it's a forgery. And I know it's kind of miserable and cynical to say, but people have been trying to trick each other to make money since the very beginning of time. And if this is a hoax, if this is an attempt to get somebody to spend a bunch of money, say 600 ducats, on this supposedly old book, it would make a lot of sense that they invested so much time and effort into creating this manuscript. The Voynich manuscript, although it certainly wasn't cheap to make, wasn't exactly made from the most expensive materials in the world. In the Middle Ages, books were very valuable, but they weren't, like, as valuable as a house. It's kind of more equivalent to, like, the purchase of a car nowadays. You might own one, maybe two of them, but it wouldn't be, like, the biggest purchase that you've ever made in your life. I think it is absolutely believable that a couple of people would invest a hefty portion of their savings into creating something that might make them a lot more when their investment returns. And if this is a hoax or a forgery, the gibberish starts to make a lot of sense. You see, it's not a simple thing to make a forgery. Say you want to make a lot of money by discovering a letter written by Benjamin Franklin. Okay, that should make you some pretty good money, but you need people to believe it. And people are going to compare your letter to actual Benjamin Franklin. They're going to compare it to his timeline, his handwriting, his writing style, his use of language, what was happening in his life. That's a lot of research to do if you want people to believe this hoax. Now, there's another option, which is not to connect your forgery to a real person, but just to choose a random time period. 1282, a census in Germany. But first off, that's not going to make you as much money, and second off, you still have to do a lot of research if you want people to believe you. But there is another option, and that is to just make something up. You make up an unknown language in an indecipherable text, and you no longer have to worry about people fact-checking you. You get together with a couple of your buddies, say 5 to 8 of them, you do some weird drawings, you paint them in, and then you sit there and you scribble stuff, your buddy imitates you and scribbles stuff, and then you have a document that cannot be proven to be fake that you can sell to the highest bidder who wants to try and figure it out. This hoax theory could even open up the possibilities of the Voynich manuscript's timeline, which might go a long ways to explaining why there are things that look like plants from the Americas in this apparently 15th century book. I still do personally think that the early 1400s is a more likely date, but if you accept this hoax theory, it opens up a lot more options for who could have created this and when. Now, this next part is purely conjecture in my personal opinion, but I do think that the hoax theory also goes a long way to explaining a lot of the weirdest parts of the Voynich manuscript. If you are creating something to be sensational and strange, you're gonna make it intentionally weird, And this might explain the weirdness of the balneological section, for example. I know that if I was trying to sell a forged medieval manuscript, I would absolutely include like 20 pages of naked women in green baths. It's what the people want to see. Now, I do absolutely understand if you have a kind of knee-jerk reaction to think that this hoax theory is kind of lame. It's not exactly fun to think that Boethius and Osmond from 1462 just pulled one over on you and they're probably laughing in their unmarked graves. And full transparency, this hoax theory has about as much proof and backing as any other theories that I've mentioned here today, possibly less. It's just my personal pet theory. But part of the reason it's my pet theory is because there's something about this idea of intentionally creating an intriguing gibberish document that just feels so inherently human. If there is one thing that human beings love more than naked women in weird baths, it's making stuff up. We spend our days daydreaming, taking the familiar things we know and twisting them, recreating old things in our new heads, using our beautiful brains to figure out what makes something look real and to replicate that within the realm of fiction. I can only imagine that in like 1,000 years' time, we're going to be looking back on the ARGs and the fictional tomes and our found footage horror movies, and we're going to assume that these things contain some kind of ineffable truth that we must puzzle out in order to discover. There's an interesting dichotomy here where we understand that nowadays we're weird and we do strange, inexplicable things, and yet we want to assume that the people of the past were better than us. We want to assume that they would never stoop to our level, but we are the exact same kind of people that we were back then, I'm sorry to say. You might be sitting here and grumbling that if people had been creating these elaborate fake manuscripts, or ipsum lorums, or glossolalia texts, we would have more of them. But the fact is that so little exists from the historical record. There could very well be 12 dozen other Voynich manuscripts that had been created as a trend in the 1400s, and we would just never know about them. There are a lot of just gaps involved in history, and I don't think that enough people realize that those gaps are filled in with the biased, changeable, and very human material of storytelling. I am endlessly fascinated by the Voynich manuscript because in its absolute unsolvability, it tells us so much about humankind. It is such an excellent example of our capacity for creativity, not just because we were able to create something as weird as that, but because 400 years later, we are still trying to fill those pages with meaning. Now, I am very aware that the comments of this video are just going to be filled with people saying, no, we already cracked this a while ago, it's this really obvious thing. And, you know, it's possible that we have figured it out, it just hasn't been recognized by academia. But I also think that we haven't figured it out, and that it's probably good that we haven't figured it out. We know so much about the world, we think we know so much about history and about humankind, but the reality is that there are so many mysteries out there. And if we can get better at examining but accepting these mysteries, I think we're going to be a lot better off. So the Voynich manuscript hasn't been figured out, and it is a mystery. And how cool is that? Now, that being said, go ahead and fill my comments with your theories and your best guesses, because that's what this whole thing is about. I will say that I don't think it was aliens. Don't bring aliens to me. They are probably real, but I think that this thing is entirely human in its weirdness. If you do want to learn more about the Voynich manuscript, my sources are linked in the description. I annotated this bibliography a bit just because there's a lot of sources and they're kind of tough to navigate, so go ahead and check that out. There's also a book published by Yale University that was hugely helpful to my process of creating this video. It has beautiful, full-color photocopies of every single one of the pages in their real size and scale, including the foldouts. And although it's a little pricey, it's a really fun book, so I highly recommend that you check that out. I'll link it somewhere probably, or I'll at least cite it if you want to find it yourself. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and do consider subscribing if you want to tune in to hear me talk about the things that I like to talk about, because I am very excited about the Voynich manuscript, and I think that if I talk to my roommate about it anymore, she's probably going to kick me out of the house, because it's all I've been talking about for 2 weeks. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.